Hello, this is Phil Browning Helsel. This is for the Maym retreat. We're talking about the second part of Dijkstra's book, just a short video. The first part was the most substantive in terms of its psychological theory, and now we're just going to be talking about some of the applications of the theory from Dijkstra's book in our context. And so I asked you to think a little bit about whether you find yourself being more like a seagull or more like Dykstra in your estimation of the trajectory of youth today. And I think some of that might just develop based on whether or not you see yourself as working primarily with troubled youth or primarily with youth who are on kind of a normal trajectory. And another developmental question you might want to ask yourself is whether Dijkstra's book tends towards young adolescents, middle schoolers, and tweens, or whether it tends towards older adolescents and some of the personality structures that get developed in older adolescents. I tend to think it's probably more the latter, with the distinctive challenges and promise of older adolescents. When kids are starting to come into their own. In younger adolescents, if you recall, there's a lot of hoping and planning and projection into the future. There's also a lot of conformity in thinking and trying to figure out what other people are thinking as well. So I think the cases in Dijkstra's book tend towards the older adolescent, even into young adult at times. So I really appreciate Dijkstra's realistic portrayal of the adolescent self, not as optimistic or naive about the self's possibilities, but he talks about how hoping with adolescence includes both doubting, fearing, and despairing, and how the disordered self is somewhat rigid and brittle. So the young person who's experiencing personality disorder is somewhat rigid and brittle. The treatment for someone like Stan at the end of Dijkstra's book, or chapter 6, really requires a kind of admitting into awareness, abandonment, depression. So admitting into awareness the sources for despair is actually the treatment. And he talks about the paradox of crying at the happy ending. So why are people allowed to express themselves just when they feel the threat of pain is past? And so he thinks of this as a metaphor for eschatological hope, in a sense only when the counselor has been tried and really passed some tests will the counselor or the youth pastor be trusted enough to share those difficult moments or be reached out to as an emotional support. In chapter 7, Dykstra talks a little bit about Lori, which is his only female case. She has some similarities to Stan in terms of a pretty low emotional threshold, and she's had some experiences with sexual assault and violence that have kind of shaped her sexuality. Indeed, she seems to kind of use her sexuality instrumentally, Dykstra thinks, in order to get other emotional needs met. I noted the question, what advice would you give to yourself at 10? I also think you could think about future-oriented questions as a way of caring for adolescents facing eschatological despair. You could say, what would your 80-year-old self tell you that you could embrace now? So Lori has some problems with cutting, which is kind of common enough, along with anorexia and bulimia among girls and also among boys now, but cutting can be a way of kind of responding to uncontrollable affect. So Dykstra says that the capacity we want to take seriously the trauma stories of someone like Lori as a sign of eschatological hope. And he looks at Lori's aunt, who's a Christian, but also he talks about Laurie's gift to others and the capacity to cry, and the identification with the cross. Pastoral care and counseling with young people can then be a way of reaching out to express God's strong feelings, or waiting for God's strong feelings. Chapter 8 is about the case of Bobby Griffith, about suicide of a young man who was gay, and it's from a book called Prayers for Bobby. It's really this is the beginning of a conversation we'll touch on a little bit further as we talk more about care for LGBTQ youth. But Bobby's questions about being gay were questions about, am I going to hell? Does Jesus love me? Can be the deeper question behind that. And Bobby wanted God to hear him, but also had kind of an excessive concern for approval, and wanting to be just like his brothers. So there's some interesting examples in the chapter of the back and forth between Bobby and his mother. But the biggest question at the heart of Bobby's life is, what does it mean to be desired by God when he didn't sense that he was desirable to others, or that there might be something wrong with him? Dykstra comes out clearly saying that Bobby's sexuality is not something that needs to be sacrificed in order for him to be faithful to God, but that his faith and his sexual orientation can belong together. So what happens then, his suicide, is a tragic consequence of a less than accepting environment. And he sees eschatological hope even past the suicide in Bobby's reappearance in his mother's dreams, with the idea that the parameters of Bobby's birth and death can't fully sustain his life. So he comes back to the mother in moments, showing that his self extends beyond this life. And Dykstra worries if, for teens like Bobby, the church's institutional stances can sometimes mimic abandonment depression for them. So the church can be an institution that creates depression for young people who are doubting or wondering about their sexuality or gender orientation or gender identity. So Dykstra says that we really don't know who we are, but that we meet ourselves coming and going in Christian life. Only a part of who we are is subject to rational planning, the kind of self we could put on the calendar. But the other part comes to us in moments when we transcend ourselves, when God speaks distinctively through our lives, and we don't know where that piece of ourselves come from. But Dykstra says that it comes from our future self, which is held in Christ. So, indeed, when we meet ourselves in moments of ecstasy, of profound religious delight, of union with God, we actually meet our future selves, or who we might be. And so you might be thinking, what does this do for our image of adolescence? Could you put the eschatological self together with Dan Siegel's brainstorm, talking about the different ways in which the adolescent mind is primed to enter into the world more fully, and then discover that it's really more than just a kind of concerted cultivation on the parents' part. No matter how we try to plan for the next test or the next set of events, there's limits to who we can be unless we receive ourselves at the same time from God, which is always a surprise, and it comes from the future. So Dykstra encourages pastors to court relationships with troubled youth, especially since that can be difficult to do. There's so many ways in which our church life and our society keep adults and adolescents separated from one another. And so he creates those kinds of mentorship moments where pastors can serve, counselors, youth pastors can serve as physicians of the soul for young people, who can come to find in their stories some sign of God's favor, some sign of God's delight. Because fundamentally, our our heart's purpose is that we might be desired by the one who desires us. Dykstra is fond of saying. And so this is really the chief question of the adolescent heart. Am I desired by God? Am I an object of desire to God who I desire? And so this is kind of the question of adolescent faith, which comes up again and again in these chapters and case studies. So I really love counseling troubled youth. There's so much in here that I wish we could talk more about, but there's a couple of points that I think are really helpful. One is that some young people today are struggling with developing a sense of self. Another is that youth pastors are typically relied upon in a couple of ways, and they have to do with the mirroring and idealizing transferences from this book. So the mirroring transference says, I want to be just like you. I look up to you because you're better than me. And that's the idealizing transference. And the twinship transference says that you're just like me. So young people often say their youth pastors, you're so much better than me, you're a holy person. Or they say you're just like me in these different ways. And then the youth pastor has a chance to respond to that. Dykstra encourages us from his readings on psychological theory not to reject those bids for relationship, but instead accept the compliments young people have for us and honor the relationship. Say something like, thank you, and it seems like this relationship means a lot to you. Kind of honor that space that's created through pastoral care. So Dykstra believes that youth ministry is incredibly complex. It's just as complex as the rich tapestry of our lives. And there's not one story to tell about it, but that it's Christ's life, death, and resurrection that allows us to suffer with troubled young people. And it's ultimately that grounding point, the fact that Christ is already present in a young person's life, which allows us to care for them with the ministry of witness and compassion. Okay, thank you for reading Counseling Troubled Youth with me for this retreat, and I'm looking forward to us getting together and talking about this. And Friday will be our day for discussing Counseling Troubled Youth. Okay, be well.